Hello, and welcome back to my basement. The Walt Disney Corporation is known for many things nowadays, but it's no secret they got their start making light-hearted animated romps. Some of their most popular films of this type are adaptations of classic fairy tales. Starting with Snow White in 1939, the Walt Disney Corporation has practically become inseparable from the idea of a fairy tale. And for many people still, these animated fairy tales are the first things people think of when they think of Disney. However, I do think it's a little strange just how much the name Disney is associated with the very idea of a fairy tale, to the point where they're almost interchangeable now. Modern day animated fairy tales are what people think of when they think of fairy tales, and I find that kind of odd. When people think of a generic fairy tale setting, they think of a picturesque, animated, Disney-like world. So let's take a look at how the Disney versions of these classic fairy tales that people have known and loved for generations have become the default versions of these stories in the hearts and minds of almost everyone in the English-speaking world. And what steps Disney has taken to maintain their control of the idea of a fairy tale.
Fairy tales have existed for a very long time, much longer than they were even written down. Early fairy tales were often told orally, being passed down for generations. The factor that differentiates a fairy tale from other forms of folk tales is the inclusion of mythical beings or other forms of magic. The term fairy tale often overlapped with what would now be considered a fantasy story.
It is actually kind of hard to define what a fairy tale is, given that the term fairy tale has changed and gone through a metamorphosis even in the last 50 years or so. This metamorphosis of the term fairy tale has a complicated history, and it's very hard to pin down where it started and how it started, and if it even started from one person or company in particular. But it's no doubt that the Walt Disney Corporation has played their hand in making this metamorphosis happen, at least quicker than it would have otherwise. Over the years, they have done what they can to censor and cleanse these original classic fairy tales. This practice can be seen going all the way back to the first feature in 1939, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
This film is an adaptation of a classic fairy tale from the 1800s written by the Brothers Grimm. The Brothers Grimm were a very strong force in the creation of many classic fairy tales. They were a major example of one of the first authors to write down fairy tales. That is, translating these classic oral traditions onto page. Cinderella, Rapunzel, Little Red Riding Hood, Hansel and Gretel, and of course Snow White were all their creations. Snow White in particular was published in the first collection of their stories and is widely known across the world. If it wasn't for the Brothers Grimm, many of these beloved stories would not exist today, and Disney would certainly not exist, at least not in its current form.
The original Snow White story goes as follows. A young girl named Snow White lives with her father and vain stepmother. Her stepmother can not comprehend that someone more beautiful than her exists, so when she finds out through way of her magic mirror that Snow White is more beautiful than her, whatever that means, she does what she can to make sure Snow White dies. The Disney film follows the same basic premise with a few differences, notably that Snow White meets the prince before she dies, and also that she is revived by true love's kiss rather than accidental Heimlich maneuver. Also, the queen's death is a little bit different. She falls to her death after tripping off of a cliff rather than being subject to third-degree burns. This adaptation was a massive success and prompted Disney to continue to adapt fairy tales.
Their next fairy tale adaptation was actually their second ever theatrically released feature film, which was their adaptation of Pinocchio, released in 1940. However, it wouldn't be until 1950 when they took another shot at adapting the Brothers Grimm with their adaptation of Cinderella. They then went on to adapt the Alice's Adventure series, Peter Pan, Sleeping Beauty, The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, The Frog Prince, Rapunzel, The Snow Queen, and many others. One thing that links all of these adaptations together is that they're for children, which is something many people consider an inherent aspect of the idea of a fairy tale. However, fairy tales were not always meant to be for children, no. Fairy tales were often meant for adults just as much as they were meant for children historically. But in the 19th century, authors began to focus more on their younger audiences. Even the Brothers Grimm themselves went back and made changes to some of their earlier works later on in their career to remove sexual references. sometimes more grotesque or violent imagery was removed to not upset the children.
Even though it's true that the practice of censoring fairy tales to make them more appropriate for young audiences happened long before Disney, Disney certainly helped a whole lot. Fairy tales were always meant to teach some sort of lesson. Even when they were marketed towards children, they weren't just pure entertainment value. There was always a moral to the story. There was always something being taught. However, with the cleansing of these stories, getting rid of all the objectionable content, many of the morals are lost. Of course, sometimes they're still there. It's not like they're just not present at all. There certainly are some morals and some good things to take away from Disney films. I'm not saying there isn't, but it's just not as present. The troubling, frightening, and sometimes scary and disturbing aspects of these classic fairy tales were there for a reason. Even when they were being cleansed by the Brothers Grimm themselves, they still kept and sometimes even ramped up some of the scary and disturbing content. This was to ingrain the message in the mind of the reader. The upsetting parts of these stories really stuck with people, especially children. Like, if you tell kids to just not go away from home and not go into the woods, they're not going to listen to you. A lot of kids like not listening to authority. They like defying authority. However, when you tell them a story about a witch who lives in the woods and wants to eat every child she sees, then yeah, they're not going to want to go into the woods. They don't want to get eaten by a witch. They're probably going to listen a little bit more than they would otherwise. But Disney removes these terrifying aspects and tones them down to the point where children probably aren't going to be scared as much by their films. They are made to be entertaining first and foremost, and whatever morals are in the story comes secondary to that.
I don't think that there's anything inherently wrong with these Disney fairy tales, but I do find it troubling that Disney has a monopoly on the concept of a fairy tale. Disney Princess is a brand now. Public domain characters like Snow White or Cinderella are inseparable from their Disney version. Disney's whole brand is basically based on maintaining the rights to these characters, which everyone should be able to use. Of course, they cannot own the rights to these stories, but they create constant merchandise, rides, sequels, remakes, costumes, characters, shows, and many more things based on these characters and stories. And when they do that, they're basically claiming ownership over them. Think about any movie that is based on a classic fairy tale that has a Disney adaptation that came out in recent years and is not related at all to the Walt Disney Company. You probably can't think of one, or at least you can't think of a successful one. Even when these non-Disney versions of these classic stories exist, they're overshadowed by their Disney counterparts.
Fairy tales nowadays are almost always associated with children's content. Content that's not violent, creepy, or disturbing in any way. The Disney version of the fairy tale is the go-to version. This Disnification of the very concept of a fairy tale has proved successful. And now all anyone thinks of when they think of fairy tale is Disney. However, that does not mean there aren't any examples of modern day fairy tales that stay true to the original roots of what makes a fairy tale a fairy tale. There are a lot of original stories coming out within the last 20 years or so, like Pan's Labyrinth, Coraline, Princess Mononoke, and many others that introduce new and fantastical worlds with a disturbing edge to them that both pay homage to these classic fairy tales and add new elements that really play off of the ideas and fears of the modern world. These modern fairy tales may be overshadowed by the Disney adaptation, sure, but they're still present. Even when the idea of a fairy tale has been bastardized and Disneyified to the point where it has practically lost meaning, many people still remember what a fairy tale is. And as long as there are filmmakers still making these kind of fairy tales, they will live on in the hearts and minds of millions of people. I know that I'll always remember what makes a fairy tale so good, and I hope you will too. Anyways, thank you for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed. If you did, please like and subscribe to my channel, and it means a lot. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.